Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 306. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent and anxious approach today, because I'm back with the queen of anxiety, Amanda Bruse. Amanda, how's it going?
Great. Happy to be here. Happy to talk about my favorite subject again.
The backstory, I guess, for those who maybe missed the first episode, Amanda was on a while back, and we had a really great talk about competition anxiety, especially. It was very well received. And I'm starting to think that this is kind of a problem that everyone who trains jiu-jitsu, maybe everyone who's alive, goes through to some degree. Yeah. And I thought this time, maybe we could get together and dig into that a bit deeper, share some very specific, tactical, actionable advice. But for those who maybe missed the first episode or aren't familiar with you, why don't you just give yourself a quick intro again?
Yeah, so my name is Amanda Bruse. I am a black belt under Andre Galvao. I train at Atos Jiu-Jitsu in San Diego. I've been training for about, I would say, 7.5-ish years. And I got into the sport really just as a form of like therapy and something to help me through like this awkward 16 to 18-year-old age where I was dealing with like a ton of anxiety, a bunch of different problems. Of course, found jiu-jitsu, changed my life, yada, yada, yada. And then I ended up just, competing, moving out to California, being at Atos, a very competitive school. And so I've just been on that whole journey for the past 7-ish years. And so I'm really excited to be here. And I definitely feel like I'm well qualified to talk about this. I also just graduated this year actually from UCSD in clinical psychology. So hopefully I'll be able to bring some of that knowledge into this chat as well.
Nice. Now I should ask, did you get into psych because of just your findings and experience with jiu-jitsu as a tool for managing and maybe creating anxiety as well?
Yeah, I think if you go to a college campus, go to the psych department, I think if you ask a lot of students of psychology get into it because of their own problems or their own just kind of curiosity of their own kind of mentality or anxiety or maybe a family member. But jiu-jitsu definitely sparked my interest for psychology. I think because I was meeting a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of different kinds of people who were using jiu-jitsu as a coping mechanism for a multitude of different problems. And that really just interested me in psychology in general. So I really just kind of fell in love with the whole field.
Now, as someone who now has both credentials on and off the mats when it comes to this, I would love to get your thoughts on this, maybe before we dig in a bit deeper. People will always talk about jiu-jitsu and its benefits from a mental health standpoint. You will also hear people talk about jiu-jitsu and how it sometimes impacts their mental health when I think, frankly, maybe they take it a bit too seriously or make it too much of their identity. But what are your thoughts on this, just holistically speaking, in terms of what jiu-jitsu maybe does or doesn't do from a mental health standpoint, an anxiety standpoint especially? I know that you particularly found it helpful, but now, you've been through school for this now. I'd love to know if you've seen any parallels between this and what the literature says.
Yeah, so there's a lot that goes into this. I think one of the main things when you ask me that question is one thing I want to preface is that jiu-jitsu is not therapy. And I know a lot of people who, they say like jiu-jitsu is my therapy, which is nice and cute, but it is not a complete replacement for something like, if you need cognitive behavioral therapy or any kind of other therapy for an actual kind of mental health problem. It is not that. However, I think there are so many positives to it that it tends to have a very positive impact on mental health. Number one, obviously, just exercise in general is really beneficial for mental health. This is backed up through like all the papers forever. Exercise is good for your mental health. And the other thing that jiu-jitsu is kind of unique in is that it has a very strong community and a safe place for you to go and be surrounded by people who are being positive and supporting you and pushing you. There's a lot of mindset work that goes into being a jiu-jitsu competitor or just hobbyist, and those tend to transfer over into other aspects of your life. So I think it can teach you a lot of different lessons and be a really great outlet. although it is not a replacement for therapy. But for me, it just helped me so much. I just got out of the house, found people who were super nice to me, started doing a sport that was really just beneficial for me. And so it kind of kickstarted my journey into my mental health kind of recovery at the time.
Yeah, very similar to, I think, the experience of myself and most people. And I would just double click on what you said, because people will always say, Jiu-Jitsu saved my life, or Jiu-Jitsu is my therapy, or whatever. And it is easy, especially when you first are in the honeymoon phase of the sport, to really fall in love with it and oversell the benefits. But it's like you said, it's important to bring up that Jiu-Jitsu has the therapeutic benefits of exercise. It also is a practice that makes you feel like you're on the path to mastery, which in itself grants fulfillment. And I really think that the social and community elements of jiu-jitsu are seriously underplayed. I mean, from my experience, I've been doing jiu-jitsu for 16 years now. I no longer think about jiu-jitsu as primarily being a martial art. I think its power as a community building tool is the best thing about it. But one thing that you do bring up is, I mean, yes, there's a lot of benefits to this, but jiu-jitsu, not a replacement to therapy. I always want to bring that up whenever we talk about this, because jiu-jitsu people, again, tend to oversell the benefit quite a bit. But I would love to maybe dig into your playbook here. So you're someone who, from a jiu-jitsu standpoint, you're a high-level competitor, and you've talked very openly about your experiences with anxiety. What are kind of the main types of anxiety that you see related to jiu-jitsu, both on and off the competition mats? I mean, I know that anxiety doesn't just live and die when you're in the bullpen or when you're out in the arena. Often anxiety happens in the training room. It happens while you're waiting for matches. It happens while you're trying to go to sleep at night. What are kind of the main stressors that you see when it comes to jiu-jitsu for a high-level competitor like yourself?
Yeah, for a high-level competitor, I think, like you just said, anxiety kind of lives in all the different facets of jiu-jitsu. It's not just going to be, oh, I get to the competition and now I'm really anxious. It's like all the time you're dealing with it in some form. So I think there's a lot of different things. One, there's a constant like pressure type of anxiety that you feel, right? So we always have this, especially once we start getting to a higher level of something and getting more quote unquote mastery of something, or doing well in something, you can have that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of just putting that pressure on yourself and then assuming that everyone else is putting the pressure on you. And then it kind of reminds me of this phenomenon in psychology we call like the spotlight effect, which is where we think that everyone is just thinking about us all the time and like everyone is judging us. And I think that is very easy for that to happen as a higher level competitor when you're going out there and you feel like you're representing your school and all that kind of thing. So that's one big one. I think that another thing is when you're in training, you put a lot more pressure on the training itself. So, you know, you're feeling like you have a bad day, a bad night of training, and you go in and you're getting kind of beat up and you're like, oh, this is indicative of what's going to happen in the competition. So you kind of overanalyze those fluctuations that are very, very normal that happen in training. No one's going to be on point all the time. It doesn't happen. And yeah, I mean, competition anxiety and a whole thing, especially when you have a competition coming up, that's an everyday anxiety. That's not something that just happens, you know, on the day of. So I think dealing with that every single day and learning how to not let that take up too much of your brain space is something that's really hard to do and something that we have to work on all the time with all the different, like as we get into talking about ways to fix anxiety, you'll be able to see how that you kind of have to use all those tools all the time, depending on where you are, what you're doing.
Right. Do you think that being a competitor changes your relationship with anxiety in a way that is different or maybe somehow more or less meaningful from a hobbyist? And the reason I bring this up is because competitors understandably deal with a lot of anxiety, right? It is a very visible performance-based art. You go out there and you win or you lose and everyone sees it. But what I always find interesting is a lot of the time, the most anxious people that I meet are people who either don't compete often or seriously or sometimes at all. I mean, a lot of the time, the people who struggle the most are people who don't compete and they really beat themselves up. And I'd love to know, as someone who is immersed in both the competitive culture, but also understands the hobbyist culture as well, do you see a fundamental difference between the types of anxiety that hobbyists and competitors deal with, or does it all kind of roll up into the same bucket at the end of the day?
I feel like the latter is more true in the way that they're feeling the same types of anxieties. Like I was talking to like, I think she's a blue belt and she was really stressed about competing. And I was asking her like, well, what are you worried about? Like, what are the thoughts that are going on right now? And she was talking about she was afraid to be embarrassed. She was afraid to let people down. She was afraid to make a fool out of herself. And I was like, oh, this sounds exactly like my negative self-talk at any competition ever, right? So I think we're dealing with the exact same types of thoughts. I think that it can be worse in people who don't compete often or who are more hobbyists because they put even more pressure on it. They catastrophize how bad it can be. And sometimes they also feel that kind of imposter syndrome, when they're comparing themselves to other, I guess, quote unquote, higher level competitors. Maybe they feel like it's not their place to go out and compete, or they feel like they're not good enough to do it. So I think they actually have another added layer that we don't have. Well, actually, we do have that, to be fair, but they have that imposter syndrome a lot, I think.
I think part of it too is they have the lack of experience of actually competing a lot or at that level. And it's easier to be afraid of something if you don't know what it is. The example I always bring up is for people who train jiu-jitsu for the first time. It's funny because leading up to starting jiu-jitsu is probably going to be one of the scariest ideas in your life. I am going to go and willingly lock myself in a padded room with a bunch of strangers who are going to try to choke me unconscious and tear my ligaments, right? It is an objectively crazy thing to do, but then you do it. And then you realize it's a bunch of like old accountants and, hobbyist mums and dads who are kind of just goofing around. It's not Fight Club. You're not going to get your face smashed in like that. And so the emotional roller coaster of people starting jiu-jitsu is always fascinating to watch because the buildup, they're so terrified. And then after they do it, it's like, that actually wasn't that bad. I guess I'll just go back next week. And I wonder for hobbyists if that's something that works against them, is because due to the lack of high profile competitive experience, they don't have that point of reference to understand how low stakes it really is when you're just goofing off in the gym.
Yeah, 100%. That's the basis of exposure therapy. And this is something that I think for my own anxiety, this is something I feel with everything, right? Like everything I'm thinking about is kind of being catastrophized. And I'm like, oh, this thing is going to be so bad and this might happen and yada, yada, and then I do it and then it's not so bad. And even with myself, I notice when I'm competing more frequently, it's way less big of a deal, like no matter what the competition is. But the bigger the gaps get, the more the anxiety kind of comes back in because you're not used to it and you're not going through that exposure therapy of actually doing it. So that's a really great point. I totally agree with you. Awesome.
Well, this gets into the topic then of what can we actually tactically do to combat our anxiety. And you brought up a few things there. We talked about cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure therapy. And of course, this isn't a therapy session, but we can maybe talk about some of the ideas there. I would love to know, what do you do and what do you recommend to people who are struggling with these different types of anxiety? So let's take someone who is maybe either they want to try jiu-jitsu for the first time and they're terrified, or maybe they want to compete. And whether it's their first competition or one coming up, they're terrified about that as well. How would you coach someone like that to get through that process and maybe come to terms with and accept that anxiety and work with it in a more productive manner?
Yeah, so tons of different tools you can use. And I would say also to keep in mind always that the tools that you're going to use are going to depend on the person and how they respond to different things and kind of what they're thinking and their thinking patterns. I think number one, the thing that I always want to tell people is that when we're trying to deal with these anxieties and these worries about whatever the situation may be, the goal of using the tools is not to get rid of the anxiety, right? Like we're never going to fully get rid of all of our anxiety. That thought in itself used to make me anxious. Like then I would just become anxious about being anxious. Like I would have meta anxiety. And so I had to learn that okay, the goal is not to completely get rid of all of this feeling. It's not even to get rid of all the physiological feelings that come with stress. It's just to learn how to manage them and restructure them. And thinking back to talking about CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, the basis of any of those types of therapies is basically cognitive restructuring, where you're taking negative thinking patterns and the first thing you're doing is identifying them. So talking to someone who's about to go into their first class, their first competition, whatever it may be, identifying what they're actually feeling, talking about it, writing it down, just hearing kind of what their actual worries are. From there, you're actually able to think of thoughts to challenge and counteract those thoughts, right? So you have a baseline, and now I'm going to think of, okay, what is something I can say to myself or repeat to myself as a mantra or talk about that can counteract these negative thoughts. And that's really the basis of reframing in general. And then I would say, then you can get into all of these other, once you're okay, hey, we're going to compete, we're going to do this, or we're going to go to the class. I think that's when tools like visualization can come into play, right? So when you're really, really anxious about something that helps me a lot is taking that catastrophic thought and thinking about, what do I really think the worst thing that's going to happen is? And then what could I do if that actually happens? Or how likely is that realistically that that's going to happen? Really, the unknowns are what scare us, right? So even just talking to other people who've gone through the experiences that you're about to go through and learning a little bit more information, maybe about what the jiu-jitsu class is going to be, maybe about what their competition experience was, that also really helped me, because then it's less of that big, unknown, scary cloud and a little bit more of feeling a sense of community and like you're talking to someone who's gone through the same thing.
It's a great point, and you bring up something important regarding visualization, which is that one of the most powerful things of visualization is that it gives you a degree of mental prep. It's almost like a lightweight type of psychological exposure to the thing that's going to stress you out. Where people think of visualization, they're often thinking about things like imagine yourself at the top of the podium. Imagine what your life could look like if you won and achieved all your goals. That's not going to help your performance. That's just going to set you up for a bigger fall if things don't go the way that you expect. What you probably want to be visualizing is the type of stuff that's going to stress you out and scare you. The thing that I often hear people talk about is they visualize the stimulus of a competition, the things that would normally scare them, like being in front of a crowd, hearing the crowd, the nervousness of just standing in the bullpen or sitting in the stands and waiting, visualizing the weird stuff that annoys you, because then you're getting an exposure to that as opposed to visualizing your dream, your lofty goal, which I don't know if it really helps you, but you're the one who's actually trained in this and experienced. So I would turn it over to you to get your thoughts on whether you think that's an accurate statement.
Yeah, I think that's 100% accurate. When I first learned about visualization, I thought it was just like, I have to imagine everything going perfect and then everything will go perfect. But that is not at all what I really think it is. I think, like you said, it is a prep for feeling the same things that you're going to feel on that day. So when I first started competing, my tactic was, I'm going to do everything I can to avoid thinking about the competition until the day of. And I quickly realized that that made me extremely ill-prepared for all of those feelings, physical and emotional, that were going to come on the day. So what really helped me was a few weeks out, month out, just in general, starting to visualize every aspect of the competition, from the morning of waking up, from getting ready to it, to driving to the competition, trying to imagine the sounds once I got inside the gymnasium, the temperature, literally down to like the visceral feelings of what the situation could be like. And then that is exactly what would trigger that feeling of anxiety. My chest would feel tight. I would feel my heart rate getting faster, all these types of things. And then I would slowly work through those feelings with them for a bit. And then I would tell myself, okay, it's time to move on. And we're not going to think about that anymore, feel that anymore. We're just going to move on with my day. The more you do that, the more you practice feeling those anxiety feelings, you start to learn how to turn them off a little bit and control them and be like, okay, we're going to move on now. We're going to calm myself down and we're going to move on to something else. If I was getting too worked up, say I was thinking about a bad scenario that could happen in the match, which is also something you should do, so you're not ill-prepared for something not going right, because that could happen. That's when I would start to add in different grounding techniques or different breathwork techniques, which if you want, I can go into a couple examples, but up to you.
Please do. I would love to hear about this. We've talked a lot about breathwork on the podcast, but I would definitely want to hear from a practical standpoint and maybe even an evidence-based standpoint if you have that info. What do you do and what do you find that works at high-level competition or for soothing anxiety in the moment when it feels like things are just spiraling out of control?
Yeah, so number one is going to be controlling your breath. I think that if you don't have your breath controlled, then definitely you're going to be feeling all those feelings of anxiety a lot more because your heart rate is going to increase. And then from there, you're just going to start feeling all those jitters. So the two that I use, very simple, very science-backed. Box breathing is one of them, which is literally just where you breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, exhale for 4 seconds. I usually do that for like a few minutes or until I feel like I'm back down to a baseline. I also really like 4-7-8 breathing, which is just where you breathe in through your nose for 4 seconds, hold for 7 seconds, and then exhale completely through your mouth for 8 seconds. That one I really, really like because I feel like the extended exhaling, getting all the air out of your lungs really, really helps me feel calmer when I'm kind of in a very heightened state. This next one, this is what I really like for just general anxiety, progressive muscle relaxation. So essentially what you do is you want to tense up individually groups of muscles starting at your toes. So thinking of all of your toes and feet and all of those muscles, whatever it may be, you tense up as tight as you possibly can that particular group for like 5 seconds, and then you release everything for 15 seconds. And starting from your toes, going all the way up to your head, all the way up to your neck and everything, each muscle group gets that exact same thing. So by the end of it, like you can imagine squeezing really, really, really tight and then letting go. You will release some of that energy, and it has made me feel a lot calmer. Even when I used to deal with like panic attacks, I would use this technique. So I really like this one for physical relaxation. And then grounding. So this is something I use when I feel like my thoughts are kind of racing and I feel like I can't get that positive kind of thinking that I need to go. Sometimes it helps you to just focus on something externally. I mean, a lot of anxiety is too much internal thinking too much about your own thoughts, about yourself and stuff like that. So if we can direct attention and focus externally, that's usually something that's going to be really beneficial to deal with those kind of negative loops. So the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique is something that is used really commonly in therapy for anxiety. Basically, you're just going to say, think about 5 things you see, 4 things you feel, 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell, and 1 thing you taste. And doing each of those things not only distracts you, but it also connects you back with your body so that you can actually feel kind of present. And most of grounding is kind of that, is connecting yourself back within your own body. Because when you're anxious, a lot of times you lose the awareness of your own body, you lose that mind-body connection. So a lot of these tools are kind of to close that gap and find yourself in your body again.
Something that is a common thread between everything you've said is that you're not trying to deny or kill or stop the anxiety. You're either reframing your focus onto something more productive, or you're coming to terms with the anxiety. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that, because when people deal with intrusive or negative thoughts, often the thing they want most in the world is to get rid of those thoughts. But most of the practices that you've described and most of the practices that I hear about, they don't encourage you to do that. And I'm sure that there's a lot of good reasons why you're going to explain why that is. I would love to hear, why is it that we do these practices to refocus our attention elsewhere rather than just trying to kill the anxiety, to get rid of it?
Yeah, well, the first thing is, if you think about it, all of these negative thoughts and these kind of loops, these are not things that just happened like that day. These are habits that have habitually entered your mind and things that you've been thinking probably likely for years. So it's not really possible to just be like, okay, I'm going to be positive today and now we're going to banish all of these thoughts, right? So this is your internal kind of monologue, and this is something that you've been dealing with for however long. So it's better to draw awareness to them and just understand that there's a difference between, I am not what I'm thinking. My thoughts can come in, but that doesn't mean that they control me. We used to use this. There was this visual that we had in one of my classes, and it was talking about like, there's an elephant and then there's a rider, and like the elephant was like your emotional brain and like the rider was like your logical brain. And if they weren't connected, then the emotional brain would kind of just run everything, right? So you had to like build that connection between the elephant and the rider and learn to just control your thoughts, but not try to completely get rid of them. And the other thing is, it's just a lot more, it's been shown that replacing negative thoughts or like counteracting them with facts is a lot more beneficial than just trying to like get rid of them. So if you can really create logic within yourself and like bring your own arguments against those logical thoughts, it gives you confidence and it gives you power to be able to be like, hey, that's not necessarily true, and that's not going to control my action. My thoughts are not necessarily going to control my actions. I control my actions. And so it gives you that confidence to actually make that split in your brain. But avoiding them at all costs is just not going to happen. So we have to accept that. And acceptance and awareness is something that's a lot more beneficial.
Yeah. Great insights there in our modern casual understanding of how our brains and bodies work. Is people often think that like the mind is who you are and the body is the vehicle that you're driving around. But the reality is that you are not your brain. You cannot control your brain completely. Your brain is just another organ in your body, a very important organ with very special purposes. But making the mistake of thinking that you are your brain is a problem, because then you're making the mistake of thinking that every thought that races through your brain is somehow indicative of who you are or what you believe. I mean, intrusive thoughts are a thing. Everyone has intrusive thoughts. And what you think, what goes through your brain, is no more reflective of who you are as a person and what you believe than whether your heart is beating. It's just an organ doing its job, right? Brain's going to brain. It's going to do the thing that it wants to do. And learning to create some distance between yourself and your thoughts is so key to mental health, because then you realize that I don't have to combat and kill every one of these negative thoughts, because they don't represent who I am. They're just background noise. My brain doing its thing and running its processes. They are not reflective of the person that I am or what I believe.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, an extreme example of this is, people with OCD tend to have extremely intrusive thoughts. And a lot of people with OCD struggle with like, oh, am I a bad person because I'm thinking this? Does this mean I'm going to do something bad? Because they feel like what they're thinking is them. But it's really just like you said, it's not true. There's definitely a distinction. What's you is more your actions, not, I've thought everyone thinks crazy stuff. Everyone has intrusive thoughts. It doesn't mean anything really.
Yeah. The example I always give is the pink elephant example, right? If you tell someone, whatever you do not think of a pink elephant, they have to, because you can't choose to not think about something. Your brain has been given a stimulus now and it's going to go off and think about something. So attaching yourself too much to your thoughts, it does create these challenges where you feel like you need to kill these thoughts, but that really isn't the best way to deal with them. Like you said, reframing or focusing elsewhere is such a powerful way of dealing with anxiety and other negative emotions.
Yeah, and this kind of, goes into a topic of there is definitely things you can do to reprogram your subconscious mind, because these thoughts that are the kind of intrusive thoughts or like maybe just negative thinking in general, these a lot of times are stemming from your subconscious beliefs or just things that you have very deeply internally. And you can do a lot to basically brainwash yourself and your subconscious to kind of start changing those thoughts into something more positive. That's just something that's more like the mental tape that you are going to go to or you're just going to think about when you're not actively thinking about things. But the power of suggestion and the power of your like subconscious mind is also very strong and is something that you can work on through a multitude of different ways.
Something I wanted to expand on that you asked earlier, you talked about talking it out and speaking with people and telling them kind of about what you're feeling and what your emotional state is and using that as a form of working through anxiety. Things like visualization or breath work, these are things that a person can do by themselves. But when you talk to someone about this stuff, it requires another person to be open with. And as I'm sure you've discovered, people in jiu-jitsu sometimes do not like talking about their feelings. And I always have tremendous respect for athletes who are open about their mental health and normalize discussing their feelings. How do you like to go about that process? I mean, if you were to use another teammate or a friend or family member as a sounding board to work out your anxiety, tactically, what does that look like? And how can we encourage people to maybe overcome their fear of sharing their emotional state?
Yeah, I mean, that is a tricky one to get into. For me, I've been really lucky. I've had a lot of teammates that, when I first started training, I was so obviously anxious that it was like it didn't feel weird for me to talk about it because I was like, hey, I'm here for being anxious. Like, obviously I'm anxious. I had a coach who was really receptive to that and was very, very open to me coming to him and talking about whatever I needed to. But as I got to other gyms, like I, came to Autos, I found some really supportive teammates. And, I think that if you go to your coach and you try to tell them about mental health or anxiety with competing and with jiu-jitsu and things like that, most of them are going to understand and be receptive. I mean, most people have gone through these types of feelings, and whether they want to talk about that in the open, that's one thing. But going to someone in private and maybe discussing this, I think you're usually going to get a good response. I have plenty of teammates who are very happy to talk to me about this kind of thing. Everyone's gone through it. And I think something you'll notice is that once you kind of are the person who's like, hey, can I talk to you about this? This is what's going on. This is how I'm feeling. Most people are going to be like, oh, hey, like I've had a similar experience. But a lot of people aren't going to be the first one to go and do that, right? So reaching out and kind of taking that risk is something you might have to do to get someone to kind of be there. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Now, what are your feelings on sharing this kind of information publicly? Like I said, there are a lot of people in the jiu-jitsu community who are very open about their mental health and the importance of mental health. And I always have tremendous respect for that. But I also completely understand athletes who aren't comfortable sharing that information. Do you find that talking publicly about your mental health with the big wide world is more helpful than just talking to your teammates?
Yes, because when I was first started training and I was dealing with I had like an eating disorder. I had like really bad depression. I was going through it. And I wish I had someone that was like so blatantly just like, hey, this is what I've been through. This is what I'm going through. And this is all okay. And I've had a lot of girls reach out to me, whether I met them at a seminar or just like through Instagram, who've told me that me just talking about it made them feel so much better. And just the first time that happened, that alone, I was like, yeah, I'll talk about it forever. Like if it gives one person that feeling of feeling comfortable to share their experiences or that they're not alone, like that makes me feel better. It makes hopefully them feel better. And so I think for me, of course, it's going to be something that I always want to be open about and talk about. And then for those people who don't feel comfortable, that's totally fine. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I do feel like for the people who are more comfortable talking about this, it is important to do so because people can feel being isolated, feeling like something's wrong with you is one of the worst feelings I think that you can feel. So if you have the capacity to do something like speaking about your mental health, I think the impact and the ripple effect that it could have, you have no idea like how many people it could be important to. So I think it's important, in my opinion.
Yeah, I am also a big fan of sharing that information publicly when you can. In terms of when you seek professional help, what are your thoughts on this? Because this is an emerging area of building a solid jiu-jitsu competition team, the understanding that mindset and sports psychology should be part of that practice. As someone who trains at a very high level team, what do you think the best practice is for how that looks like? Do you think that everyone should have a therapist or a sports psychologist that they work with, or are those roles that you prescribe for certain scenarios?
No, I mean, in reality, it would probably help everyone who could afford it and if it was accessible to you. I think sports psychology is something that for a long time was really overlooked. And it was kind of just like a brute force through it kind of thing. And now there's so much science about all of these different facets of like how your mental health affects your performance and all of these things and just all of these different tools you can use as an athlete. So I think if you have it accessible, of course, I think everyone should try to have some type of either sports psychologist, or if you're dealing with a lot of things outside of jiu-jitsu, I think the carryover, kind of a side note, but I think the carryover from going to regular therapy and dealing with whatever may be going on with you, that carryover to jiu-jitsu is probably something that's pretty big, because if you're not fixing yourself, you can't expect yourself to perform super well. So besides even just sports psychology, just if you have things that you are going through, getting those handled with someone professionally is probably going to have just as much carryover as like getting a sports psychologist to tell you how to visualize, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And for people who haven't done this, what should they expect? You know, we all who have trained jiu-jitsu for a while, we have all been through the practice of going to a class, understanding the structure of how people teach us the technical aspects of jiu-jitsu. But if we were to actually sit down and have someone professional work with us on things like mindset or anxiety, what should people expect? What does that process actually look like?
So, I mean, with therapy, it would be different. With mindset, I think they're pretty similar. I think the main thing is identifying and being aware of the things that you think are holding you back. So that could be like, hey, we're going to walk me through all of your thoughts as you're leading up to competitions. You know, what do you feel like the main barriers to your performance are? What are some things that you feel like you struggle with leading up to competition or training or whatever it may be? Is there anything that you're hoping to improve on? So a lot of discussing and trying to kind of identify the key points of what you think might be something you need to work on, and then structuring some type of plan. And that could be something that's tangible, not tangible. That can be homework, such as stuff they give you in CBT, where you are writing down, you know, the limiting beliefs that you have about, hey, I don't feel like I'm good enough to win worlds because of this, this, and this. And then finding something that you're going to substitute every time you think about that. So working with someone to really figure out the key points, the key negative thoughts, and then what are we going to say to restructure and kind of work on that. And then you can also, you know, there's a lot of different things as far as mantras and routines. You know, sports psychologists can work with you on how are we going to build your game day routine that's going to make you feel the most confident? What mantras are we going to use to substitute and repeat in your brain when you're pushing yourself the hardest that you can, and things like that, I think is like a good beginning into kind of what sports psychology is like. So
on the topic of mantras, what does a good mantra look like? And do you find these things to actually be helpful?
So I have specific mantras for myself when I compete. Like as soon I have a deal with myself, kind of like when I get to the bullpen and when I get to like really about to be on the mat, like I kind of switch into my competition persona that's very confident. And, you know, it can be fake basically, but it's like, I'm going to act like this and I'm going to repeat this in my head until I get on the mat. Mantras are really just finding something that elicits a certain feeling within you. So my mantra is, I usually, when I'm about to go on the mat, I repeat to myself, this is my time, I deserve to win. This is my time, I deserve to win. And I just repeat that over and over and over. And it's possible that it's less even about the mantra and it's more that you're just getting rid of all of the negative thoughts and repeating something over and over. There is no room for me to have negative thoughts right now. We are just locked in saying something that I feel gives me confidence, something that I say every time before I compete, and trying to elicit that kind of state that I'm hoping to have once I step on the mat.
Got it. Now, I want to talk about something you just touched on. You talked about lying to yourself. And this is something that people sometimes think, right? When you're trying to insist on a mantra or you're trying to add positivity to your thought process, people will sometimes feel like, aren't I just lying to myself? But there's actually reasons why taking this approach is helpful and insisting on this mindset and to get over the fear that you might be lying to yourself. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, again, this is kind of similar to your subconscious mind, and a lot of the things even standing up straight and things like that. There are so many things that influence your actual emotions and how you're feeling that you're maybe not even aware of. And it might feel like you're lying to yourself, or, when I repeat this, it feels weird, I feel fake. But over time, when this is what you're feeding your brain, you start to believe it and you start to feel like that. And it might take a lot of time because, like I said before, you're combating, thinking that you've had for years and years possibly. So it's going to feel weird. It's going to feel like, oh, this is just kind of cringy. I don't really feel like I'm lying to myself. I don't really feel like this. But there's two parts of you, and you're trying to combat that negative part, and you're taking care of your brain and trying to feed it better and new information and reprogram your brain. And reprogramming your brain takes time, it takes consistency, and it takes getting through some of those periods where maybe it's so stupid, but fake it till you make it. My mom used to tell me this. Everyone's mom probably told them this. It is so accurate if you really just want to dumb down all the research, literally fake it till you make it. And slowly your brain actually changes and adapts to these thoughts that you're trying to put into it.
Yeah, it is a cognitive behavioral therapy tactic that is sometimes called acting as if or reflecting as if, which sounds way more intelligent than the more common answer, which is fake it till you make it. That's one of those things that you hear and you think, this can't possibly be good advice, but it actually is. And this comes down again to just a misunderstanding of the relationship between our minds and ourselves. People often think that the mind is the overlord, and when it thinks something, then that thought happens and the body takes action. But in reality, the relationship between the mind and the body and who we are is much more complicated than that. So it's not always the case that if I feel a certain way, then I'll be able to do those things that way. Often it's the opposite, which is where if I just start doing these things, it will change the way that I feel. You brought up some good examples. There is evidence that if you force yourself to smile more, you will be happier, which is the opposite of what people often think. Turns out that if you just smile a lot more, it actually changes your mood and makes you happier. So believe it or not, fake it till you make it is actually backed by science to some extent. And as a cognitive behavioral therapy technique, it can be a good way to change your mindset by doing things before you actually start feeling that way. And if you do things enough, then eventually your brain catches up.
Yeah, it's a two-way street. This is something that applies to a lot of different things, but physiologically, that mind-body connection, it doesn't go one way. It's not like, oh, I'm happy, so I smile. Another great example that really helped me actually was feeling confident. If you look at people who are maybe feeling anxiety or feeling shy, they tend to make their body smaller. This could be by crossing your hands, kind of curling your back, and kind of closing the space that you're taking up. So if you are able to open your chest, put your arms down, hold your head up high, put your shoulders back, do a posture that we consider, oh, that person's feeling confident, it does the opposite. Then it makes you feel a little bit more like that. So 100% you're correct on this. It's very accurate.
Yeah. That's one of those things that really blew my mind when I first heard about that, because it's so much the opposite of how we assume our brain and our body interact. We think that the brain is the boss, but it really isn't. It's just an organ with a specific job, and it can be influenced by the rest of your body just as much as it can be the thing that influences your body.
100%.
Awesome. So I would definitely want to ask you one more question here on the topic of journaling. Do you find that to be a helpful practice? I mean, we've talked to our mutual friend, Rachel Ranshaw, a lot about journaling and note-taking in jiu-jitsu. I know that a lot of people use journaling as a practice to get their thoughts out there. Do you find that to be something helpful with anxiety?
Absolutely, yes. And I guess I do two types of journaling. I think, though, the main benefit for me with journaling has also been tracking the progression of how I'm thinking and how I'm feeling. I have journals all the way from 5 years ago when I was consistently journaling. And I think being able to look back and see how much you've grown is something that really helps give you confidence. The other thing about journaling is usually our thoughts are worse when they're just housed in our head. And what I mean by that is like usually when you're thinking something and you're alone with that thought and you're feeling it, it seems a lot worse. But when you put it out on paper, it's a lot easier, for me at least, to be a lot more logical or analytical, or maybe realize that something's not as big of a deal as it was in my head. It sounds way less bad on paper. So I think it is important, and it's a good way to just be able to dump whatever you're feeling and not be worried about, if you don't want to go talk to someone or you're feeling like you don't want to feel judged for something. It's a completely safe place where you can just put all of your thoughts down. And I think that's something that's super important, is to not keep all of your thoughts housed in your head all the time.
I would love to know all of these practices together. Do you see anxiety management and maybe just emotional regulation as part of a practice for a complete jiu-jitsu athlete? Because when we go to the gym, most of the time your instructor is concerned about teaching you how to play guard, or they're going to give you very technical details. They're going to be focused on the how you do jiu-jitsu part of jiu-jitsu. But of course, as you become more of a jiu-jitsu professional and you're doing this for a living, you need to start thinking about things like strength and conditioning, nutrition, presumably mindset. Do you think there is a place for either part of the standard jiu-jitsu class that focuses on things like emotional regulation, or do you think that is actually something that coaches should offer in jiu-jitsu, or do you think that this is best suited kind of being kept separate?
I think both, honestly. I think everyone should have their own practice of what they need to go through. Like, if you're going to wake up and journal and take care of yourself in whatever way, in whatever form it may be. But I think that it should at least be something that is brought up in classes. Maybe it's not a full curriculum, but I mean, Galvao talks a lot about mindset. He has a lot of talks with us about everything. And, he's very open to you coming to him. He's always telling you to come to him if you need to talk about anything. And, sometimes I think breath work is something that would be really beneficial. Talking about emotional regulation, maybe talking about how to, at least in a jiu-jitsu setting, so that it's more kind of like, it's easier for people to kind of grasp, right? In that kind of setting, it won't feel as weird as just like, hey, we're going to meditate together. Like talking about how to control emotions when we're leading up to a match or during training, and kind of incorporating that into maybe some kind of breathwork practice, something to teach some kind of physiological regulation would be really, really beneficial, whether that's like before, after class, or in a competition class, practicing the type of breathing you're going to do before you go out to the match. I think something like that would be super helpful. And just keeping the doors open for communication as well.
That is a really interesting point. And I've given this feedback to junior belts before. I would encourage, if you are a more experienced grappler and you're rolling with someone who's junior and you really want to help them, make sure that you're not just teaching them technical details, but also help them with things like regulating their breathing and regulating tension.
Yeah.
Something that I like to do is suggest to people, if you feel like maybe your breathing is out of control or you're too tense when you're rolling, it can be hard to detect that in yourself at first until you get experienced. So what can be helpful is ask your training partners to tell you, because they'll recognize the cues. If I'm rolling with someone and their breathing is out of control, maybe they don't know it, but I know it. I can tell them, and that makes it easier for them to identify that that's happening and then to stop and slow down. Same with being too tense, which is another common body cue. I mean, when you're sparring with someone, if they are really, really tense, you know that either they're inexperienced or they're afraid or both. And that's never a sign that you want to be giving off, not just because you're telegraphing yourself, but you're also burning out your muscles faster. Again, your brain and body work together. So if you're constantly tense, you're going to feel mentally like you're tense. And so it's a good practice, much like with your breathing, to learn to relax when you're rolling. And so that's a favor that I always suggest that the more experienced belts do for the more juniors, is coach them on this. Don't just tell them how to tighten up their armbar, but tell them how to control their breathing, how to be looser and more relaxed when they're sparring so that they're not all wound up completely.
Yeah, and I think people know how important breathing is, but I don't know if people understand the level to which breathing is important. The ability to really fully breathe and have full capacity in your lungs and really be breathing properly, I could probably roll like 5 times better or as long and not get winded. Not doing any other techniques, just being better with my breathing. And I think so is something that's so important. Everyone used to gas out like the first round. It wasn't because your cardio was quote unquote bad. It's because you were tensing up and like never breathing the entire time.
Yeah. It's funny. When I was earlier on in my journey, jiu-jitsu was the best workout that I'd ever discovered. I got into amazing shape, but then my jiu-jitsu got better and I started getting more efficient. And now I don't burn as many calories, but I can train for a much longer period of time.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the same with me. I'm like, oh wait, I could rest here. Now I can actually just chill because I can, but should I?
Yeah. Something else I would ask you, I mean, obviously you have kind of gone through the studies here. Are there any resources that you would recommend to pretty much any grappler who's looking to optimize their mindset, to optimize for anxiety? Any books or resources or practices you found that you would definitely recommend people check out?
I have a list of books. I'll name a few books. For me, I really like reading. If you don't like reading, I'm sure there's a lot of resources out there as far as just like looking up mindfulness habits or like watching YouTube videos on mindfulness, watching YouTube videos on maybe even podcasts, which I don't have any linked in my brain right now. But I do have some books that I really, really, really like. One of my favorites that I think most athletes are willing to read because it's for athletes is Mind Gym, An Athlete's Guide to Inner Excellence by Gary Mack and David Casstevens. This book is amazing. It really touches on a lot of different topics as far as being an athlete. It's talking about focus and mental toughness and practical advice on how to kind of improve these different areas as an athlete. So that is one that I would really recommend. And it's not too long. It's very concise. So I really recommend that one to kind of get a big overview. The other one that I really want to mention is called Mindset, The New Psychology of Success by Carol Dweck. She is a PhD psychologist. Amazing book. It really breaks down the difference between growth mindset and fixed mindset and how to kind of make your brain more malleable and change the mindset to have that improvement and be able to constantly improve your brain in a bunch of different areas. And then I have one more. This is my favorite book ever right now. It's a little bit more like if you're into like metaphysical stuff or like kind of a little more out there, but it's all the same kind of stuff. And I think that some people need to hear the same material voiced in a different way for it to really click. So this is something that I really liked that clicked for me. It's called The Power of Your Subconscious Mind by Joseph Murphy. And it really, really goes into how to brainwash yourself and the power of your subconscious mind, the power of your thinking, how your thinking relates to actions and things like that. So if you like more like metaphysical stuff, this one will hit differently for you. And then one more is called Mindfulness for Beginners. It's by John Kabat-Zinn, I think is how you say his last name. My favorite first-time beginner mindset book, how to ground yourself, how to stay mindful, gets into a little bit of meditation practice. If you don't have a ton of experience with mindfulness, this is the book that I would definitely recommend. So those are the main resources that I have for you.
Awesome. And hey, I do have some podcast resources to plug if people want. Episode of BJJ Mental Models 218 featuring Amanda Bruse.
Great.
That was our earlier chat about anxiety. I'll link to all of these things in the show notes, by the way, to make it easier. We've also had a series of great conversations with Dr. David Lay. He's a clinical psychologist operating out of New Mexico and a BJJ black belt. And he's been on here before talking about cognitive behavioral therapy and anxiety, and I'll link to those as well because I think a lot of that is probably a great expansion of what we've talked about here today. But I mean, great chat, Amanda. I know that you came very well prepared to this call. Anything else that you wanted to add here that we didn't touch on in the conversation? I just want to make sure that we get to all of the topics that you had in mind.
Let me make sure. Check my little notes here. Yeah, I talked about all of that.
I love it when people bring notes. It makes me so happy.
I know, it's that academic in me. This is so random, but just talking about competition, I have like one more tip that I just could end on. For people who deal with a lot of competition anxiety, one thing I want to suggest to you is to warm up very, very, very well. To deal with that initial adrenaline dump and to deal with that kind of like sometimes we can kind of black out when we go into a match. To deal with all those feelings, which I have dealt with, the best thing I found is to warm your body up so much that you feel like you've rolled like 3 to 4 rounds. When you're in the gym, your best round is not your first round, right? Like you go to training and your best rounds, once you start and you get in the flow. That's how much you need to warm up before you go step on the mat. Do not under warm up, especially if you're prone to anxiety. I would rather you over warm up and get all of those feelings out and have your body prepared. So that's just something I wanted to mention because that was something I didn't implement until I was like a black belt. And I was like, oh yeah, that's important.
Definitely makes sense. That's actually great advice too. I mean, especially as I get older, my first round is usually a disaster. It takes me a while to get moving now.
Oh yeah. My first round is never that great at all. It's always like my closest round for no reason, but.
Awesome. Well, hey, I got a question for you. If people want to find you or contact you or maybe swap stories or get your advice, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, reaching out through Instagram is probably the easiest. My Instagram handle is amandabruce.bjj and Bruse is Bruse. That's probably the easiest way. I'll usually respond on there, and feel free to reach out with any kind of inquiries. I think my email is attached to my Instagram as well. I also have a Linktree submission form on my profile, so any of those ways would be perfect.
Amazing. Well, I will put links to all of that in the show notes. I'll also put a link to our stuff. Everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. Tons of episodes of the podcast there, all completely free. Also, our newsletter lives there, and of course, our premium services. If you want to know how we pay the bills and you want to be a part of what I think is one of the best communities out there, join BJJ Mental Models Premium. You get a lot of stuff by doing that. First of all, you get a massive library of audio courses on jiu-jitsu strategy, tactics, concepts. You get access to our entire network of pro podcasts featuring some great material from folks like Emily Kwok, Johannan. Rob Bernacki is going to be coming soon and doing an ongoing podcast with us. So a lot of great material if you're interested in kind of more how pros think about jiu-jitsu and you want to see their methods unpacked. And of course, if you join our coaching tier, you also get rolling reviews. Amanda is one of those coaches. So if you want Amanda to tell you that your jiu-jitsu is dog shit, this is probably the best way to...
I will do that.
Theoretically, if you wanted her to... I don't think she will, but... We do have some coaches who definitely will tell you that your jiu-jitsu is dog shit if that is more your speed. But Amanda is an amazing coach there, and this is a great way to get reviews from her. Amanda's also, of course, one of our sponsored athletes. Anything exciting coming up on the horizon, Amanda, while we've got you here?
Yes, I have a couple, like a small super fight, and then I'm mainly gearing up for Nogi Pans and Worlds, hoping to take those two this year. Go
get them. Well, looking forward to seeing you out there. But thanks a lot, Amanda. This is a great one.
Thank you so much. I really had a great time.
Most welcome. Thanks to the listeners, too. We'll talk to you next time. Take care.